A quick note before today's episode. Last week, I talked a little about my mom's passing. She passed 2 days before Christmas. But I wanted to add one thing as a way of being helpful. My mom had a series of strokes. One of the things that has brought me a lot of peace this past week, surprisingly, was her health directive. And I realized that that's an unusual thing to point to. Her decline was fairly quick. She was never on life support, so there were no major decisions of that nature. But there were small decisions, such as whether or not to bring in hospice for the final 2 or 3 days of her life. Health directives are mostly presented as a way to ensure that your wishes are followed at the end of your life. But they also provide comfort for those who stay behind. In the days after her passing, when my mind went through all the things that had happened following her strokes, trying to sort it out, this typically happened at night. This was one of the things that brought me a lot of peace, a small anchor in all of that trouble, knowing what her wishes were and that we were able to follow them. I realized that this note may only affect a few listeners, but I wanted to put it out there as something to tuck away and to consider later, because it may help someone close to you at some point. It has helped a lot here, and maybe this note might help others as well. This past week, I also put together our monthly news and analysis episode. It actually felt pretty good to do that, to swim in some familiar waters, even as my sister and I planned for a celebration of life and other things. The films, the parks, the history of the Disney company are experiences that most listeners here enjoy. I enjoy them too. In looking through old photo albums, I'm always surprised how many times my parents took me to the park when I was a kid. And so today we have 4 parts. We cover everything from the future of cinema, to the struggles of Avatar 2, to problems at the parks, and finally, new developments in Florida's bill to shut down Reedy Creek, which is that special tax district arranged around the Disney resort. To me, it seems like forever since I recorded the news and analysis episode at the start of December. But if you're ready, I am too. Let's go. Our first story is on Avatar 2 and the current state of the cinema. And since I'm recording this in California during the first week of January, as a series of strong storms comes ashore, you'll almost certainly hear the sound of rain in the background, which maybe is thematically appropriate, as the film's subtitle is The Way of Water. As we discussed during the pandemic, the closure of theaters during COVID accelerated trends that were already moving through movie distribution channels. In 2022, the top 10 grossing films in America were all franchise films, mostly focused on special effects or family-friendly animation. Disney released 4 of those films. The films are all easily recognizable and played well overseas. They included Top Gun: Maverick, Avatar 2, Jurassic World Dominion, Doctor Strange 2, Minions 2, Wakanda Forever, The Batman, Thor: Love and Thunder, Fantastic Beasts 3, and Sonic 2. For the 7th year in a row, Disney was the best performing company at the global box office, taking in $4.9 billion, with nearly $2 billion coming from domestic ticket sales. In the number 2 position was Universal, which took in $3.9 billion worldwide. Though Disney did very well overall, it also had some key films that underperformed at the box office, either due to story development, how the films were marketed to the public's belief that they could just wait a few weeks and then watch them on Disney+, or the public's reluctance to pay $10 or $12 to see the film on the big screen if it didn't present a visual spectacle. Among those films that underperformed for Disney because they didn't fit into one or more of these categories were Strange World and Lightyear. Not only was the overall box office down in 2022 for all studios combined, but more significantly, the number of studio films that were released widely to American screens was also down. Though there were hundreds of films that showed up briefly in a few theaters in 2022, if we look at studio releases that took in a minimum of $10 million, which is a very low bar, we find that there were only 73 studio films widely released in 2022, compared to nearly double that, or 132 films, back in 2019, the last year before the pandemic. Mid-budget films targeted at adults are noticeably missing from this mix. And in terms of people in theater seats, though younger audiences have returned in number to American movie houses, adults really haven't. So the problem here is that there's not only a smaller audience interested in leaving the home to see a film, there are simply less films widely released for an audience to see. And because of the kid and teen-focused market, theaters really only have a good week when a tentpole movie shows up, such as The Batman or Avatar. Theaters were noticeably empty between August and November when no franchise tentpole films were offered up to the public. I'd say that the period of empty theaters was after Minions 2 and Thor and until the arrival of Wakanda Forever. One of the central problems that Disney faces in elevating box office sales is retraining their audience to actually go to the theater, as opposed to waiting for a title to show up on Disney+. There are clearly different social experiences for watching a movie at home versus at the theater, with the theater experience often being aesthetically superior to the one at home. At the theater, there's a better screen, better sound system, people turn off their phones, and generally, everyone gives their full attention to the screen. But this elevated viewing aesthetic by itself, at least so far, hasn't persuaded a lot of viewers to leave their living rooms and drive down to the multiplex. Many viewers are aware of this aesthetic exchange, but overall these viewers are saying the benefits, ease, affordability, and comforts of being at home simply outweigh the benefits of visiting the multiplex unless the film offers a visual spectacle enhanced by the big screen experience. And even then, some people who used to go to the movies fairly regularly are still staying at home post-pandemic. What's being lost in terms of genres at the new multiplex are dramas, comedies, personal films, and passion projects. Under Bob Chapek, and largely due to the pandemic, Disney saw many films, including those from Marvel and Pixar, either premiere on Disney Plus or be released as a paid option on Disney Plus on the same date they were released to theaters. Other films showed up about a month after they were released to theaters, most recently Strange World. But under Bob Iger, Disney seems to be reconsidering that part of the plan. Disney has held back on releasing Wakanda Forever on Disney Plus far longer than other recent releases. Disney just announced a premiere date for Wakanda Forever on its streaming service, which is February 1st. That's 82 days after the film premiered in theaters, the longest theatrical window for any Disney film since the pandemic. It's just 8 days shy of the standard pre-pandemic theatrical window, which was 90 days. At this point, I think it will be very difficult for Disney, or really any studio, to move away from that early streaming option for its films. That is an option that is engaged reasonably soon after a film is released to theaters, somewhere between 1 and 3 months. I think it's going to be nearly impossible to put that genie back in the bottle and return to pre-pandemic practices concerning theaters. I think it would be far smarter for Disney to explore how to make streaming more profitable, as a significant percentage of viewers who got comfortable watching new films at home simply aren't returning to theaters as often as they did before the pandemic, and some of this is already beginning to happen. Later this year, Disney Plus will add audio support to enhance a set of 13 Marvel films along with Pixar's Lightyear, so that they deliver IMAX signature sound by DTS over the streaming service. Home viewers will need to have either an IMAX enhanced TV or an IMAX DTS audio receiver to decode the new signal. But these elements, and maybe at some point down the road they are offered at a price premium, are a way to reconfigure the film experience for those people who have moved into their homes to experience film. Though theaters offer communal viewing experiences with minimal disruptions, as I mentioned earlier, these benefits aren't persuasive enough to lure back all of the audience the multiplex lost to streaming during the last 3 years. What has been persuasive, though, at least with certain films, is the large screen for a deeper visual experience. When a film offers a unique visual experience that lends itself to the big screen, such as Avatar 2 particularly in 3D, or Top Gun Maverick particularly in the ultra-widescreen format ScreenX, more people will see that as a reason to leave the house and watch the movie in a theater. Typically, there's a $5 to $10 surcharge for these experiences, and these upcharges can add significantly to a film's box office gross. IMAX presently accounts for 11% of Avatar 2's overall gross, even though IMAX screens themselves account for a very small percentage of screens showing the film. Beyond this, audiences will also return to the multiplex in number. When a film's visuals are so rich, a large screen deepens the experience of seeing the movie. Large studios each have a few movies that fit this paradigm every year. Next year, Disney has 3 Marvel films plus 1 Indiana Jones film that fits this model perfectly. Assuming these films aren't terrible, these titles will do well with a traditional box office release. But then Disney has some other titles that don't fit this model that well, such as The Little Mermaid live-action remake and the film based on The Haunted Mansion, which, like Lightyear and Strange World this past year, may or may not fare well in theaters. These films, at least from what we know about them today, have more in common with films that might be easily enjoyed with a home theater system. The Little Mermaid, released on May 26th, seems positioned to do better than Mansion, as it will pick up some younger audience members soon to be on summer vacation. But both of these films, I'm guessing, will depend more on word of mouth and reviews than Indy or those Marvel films, or more pointedly, than similar films released before the pandemic. But let's look at Avatar 2 for a moment and consider what it reveals about how the movie experience will evolve in 2023 and beyond. Avatar 2 falls into the sweet spot for a movie that has the potential to do big box office in a post-pandemic world. It's a franchise sequel to the highest-grossing movie of all time. It was released in 3D as the sequel to the film that started the digital 3D revolution 13 years ago, and it combines action, digital effects, and strong visuals that will play well on a big screen. Moreover, director James Cameron, whether or not this was his intention, crafted a film for a wide audience, including older children. I had a bit of a crisis of faith as we were cutting the movie together, he explained in an interview. It was too violent. I wanted a balance between the beauty, the epiphany, the kind of spiritual aspect of the film with the action, and I felt it had gotten a little too grim. I actually cut about 10 minutes of the movie targeting gunplay action. You have to have conflict, of course. Violence and action are the same thing, depending on how you look at it. This is the dilemma of every action filmmaker, and I'm known as an action filmmaker. There is action, but the violence is toned down, which should make the film more acceptable to families with tweens. Beyond this, Avatar 2 is an expensive gamble, and for Disney it needs to do well. Not only does it support a franchise that extends into the theme parks, it also sets up a series of expensive films to follow. Avatar 3 is already in post-production, and according to James Cameron, sections of Avatar 4 have already been filmed. In part, the filming was done so that younger actors would continue to look young until the end of the multi-film story. Otherwise, you get, and I love Stranger Things, but you get the Stranger Things effect, he said, where they're supposed to still be in high school, but they look like they're 27. It's probably useful at this point to point out that James Cameron has a different strategy here than other high-profile Disney franchises. The Star Wars trilogies each offer a continuous story in which an audience needs familiarity with previous plotlines to understand what is at stake and the personal investment of many of the characters. Marvel functions more as an interconnected universe, but in that the audience needs to be very familiar with many individual characters introduced and developed in previous films to understand the narrative flow of the current movie. Marvel films together aren't continuous narratives so much as they are a collection of characters that at this point the audience needs to know before they enter the theater. The Avatar films, however, at least so far, sort of like James Cameron's work on the second Aliens film and the Terminator films he's directed, offer a story in a unique world familiar from a previous film with just a few returning characters and with a standalone story that anyone can easily grasp whether or not they've seen the previous film or remember the characters and plot of that previous story. I suspect that this by itself might expand the audience for Avatar 2, especially in global markets, but maybe I'm wrong here, as there's also an interesting experiment playing out in terms of audience preferences with these three approaches. Assuming that most films in the Avatar, Marvel, and Star Wars franchises are well made and have engaging storylines, this combination begins to ask the question as to which approach to franchise films might be the most successful in terms of financial returns. Is it the type of franchise film that requires little previous knowledge of previous films, such as with Avatar? Is it the type of franchise films that requires a limited previous knowledge, such as with the Star Wars trilogies that require at most a knowledge of 2 previous films before seeing that third film? Or is it the type of franchise film that requires a deep, ongoing knowledge of many films and many streaming series to fully engage a new film project, such as within the Marvel Universe? Or to put this another way, does creating films for a very invested fan base, such as with Marvel, prove more successful than creating films for a more casual film base where a deep previous understanding of many characters is not required, such as with Avatar? But this in ways is outside the scope of this article. A large part of the financial prospects for Avatar 2 relies on the global box office, including China, where the first Avatar movie was a major success. That country alone accounted for roughly 10% of the original Avatar's gross. For more recent films, however, such as Endgame, the Chinese box office accounted for 25% of the film's overall take. Though China has declined releases for other recent Disney films, particularly for those created by Marvel, in late November the Chinese government officially approved Avatar 2 for a national release. This created the possibility that the film might eventually clear $2 billion worldwide at the box office. But this is where the problems began. The film was set to release just days after China revised its zero-COVID policy, creating more openness, but also the situation in which COVID spread more quickly. In many places, Chinese residents wishing to see any movie need to present a negative COVID test, but even with that, hundreds of theaters initially scheduled to present Avatar 2 were closed or otherwise delayed in showing this engagement as hospitals around the country began to fill with people sickened with COVID. Many people then, by choice, chose to stay at home as COVID began to move more quickly through the Chinese population. The film still is performing well. It ended with the 4th highest opening weekend for a film in China this past year, but nowhere near its potential in a pre-COVID world. After the government changed its COVID policies, analysts cut box office projections in China in half, as it was clear that many theaters would go dark during December. In the U.S., the opening weekend also wasn't great for Avatar 2. The blame here is mostly on the people that Bob Chapek placed in positions to oversee media budgets, distribution, and promotion. Conservative industry projections placed the opening weekend in the U.S. at 150 million to 175 million. Some analysts were looking for 200 million, as a large chunk of Avatar's tickets would be in venues with a surcharge. 33% of tickets on opening weekend would be sold for venues with standard 3D, another 12% for venues with IMAX 3D, all of which should raise the overall gross. But by the film's second day, Saturday, it was clear that Avatar 2 wouldn't come close to these estimates. Estimates kept trending down as the weekend went along. In the end, the film came in at $134 million in domestic ticket sales, the sixth highest December opening behind Spider-Man No Way Home and 4 Star Wars films, but an overall disappointment for Disney. Disney's stock fell by over $4 the following Monday, which was largely attributed to the underperformance of Avatar 2. But the film had strong exit scores with audiences. According to CinemaScore, a company that polls audience members on opening night, Avatar 2 ranked at 91% positive. This translated into word of mouth, which then started to promote the film in a way that Chapek's team was unable to do before the film was released. But the COVID situation in China and poor promotion were the only barriers to the film's financial success. The film was released just before the holiday break, in large part to capitalize on the time that children and college students have off from school and the time that many adults choose to take away from work, particularly the days between Christmas and New Year's. But during that week this year, large sections of the country, including the Northeast and the Midwest, were pummeled with severe storms, keeping millions at home and closing nearly 100 theaters. Despite this, riding on strong word of mouth in warmer parts of the country, the film still performed well during this stretch. As the film entered its third week, it showed signs of having staying power, particularly on international screens, which suggested that the film, despite the production and advertising budget, would eventually be profitable. By the end of the New Year's Day weekend, Avatar: The Way of Water had grossed nearly $1.5 billion. After 3 weeks of release, it was the 13th highest-grossing picture of all time, with indicators that it would easily make it into the top 10. For many regions, Avatar 2 is the highest-grossing film since the start of the pandemic. There's also a reasonable chance that the film may break $2 billion at the box office, a feat only accomplished by 5 films so far, all of them released before the pandemic. But there's also some barriers for this as well. In addition to those other factors, the film oddly isn't doing well in Japan, and the film isn't being released at all in Russia, which is related to sanctions stemming from the war in Ukraine, though reportedly some Russian cinemas have been able to get pirated copies of the film, which are being shown in some cities. Still, the money made off of these pirated copies won't go back to Disney or Cameron to add to the official box office. But on the other side, this film should also have a long life in theaters. There's no other film with blockbuster potential set to be released until Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania hits theaters on February 17th, and this is also part of that larger problem facing multiplexes. There's a lack of material that will draw a post-COVID audience out to big screens right now. If I were to make a couple final observations about Avatar 2, they would be these. Visually, it's a stunning film that definitely presents a believable alien world. As I mentioned earlier, though this is a sequel that has some characters carried over from the first film, you can easily enjoy this story as a standalone episode. But this film tracks with one of the other recent cinematic trends that we've discussed on this podcast. For me, most movies from the 1980s through the early 2000s feel like the visual equivalent to a long-form short story or maybe a novella, with a limited set of characters and a direct linear plot. Avatar 2 feels far more like a novel in terms of its pacing, range of characters, world building, and plot development. In thinking about Avatar 2, I am again reminded how published stories developed in America. The first wave of popular published stories emerged in magazines in the early 1800s. These were relatively short, maybe 8 or 10 or 12 pages. There were novels at this time, but there was a greater emphasis on stories that could be included in magazines, in large part because the technology existed to widely print and distribute magazines as opposed to books. But as power or steam presses became more sophisticated, the locus of published stories shifted from magazines to books, as the technology was then able to publish book-length works at a lower cost. We rarely think about art, particularly the literary arts, as being constrained by technology, but this was one of the big limiting factors of writerly production in the early 1800s. I see something similar happening today. Now that there is the technology and the available budgets to create longer works of cinematic sophistication, audiences are migrating to limited series on streaming services that offer more depth, just as audiences 175 years ago shifted from short stories to novels. And Avatar 2 fits within this trend, as it explores ways that a movie in a theater might offer some of the character depth and plot breadth that is now found often in limited series, such as in Andor, WandaVision, and The Queen's Gambit. But to shift back to that original topic for a moment, to the challenges that theaters now face in a post-pandemic world, maybe the bigger point is this. Avatar 2 highlights Hollywood's struggle to find material that will succeed in theaters in a post-pandemic world. I do understand the longing to enjoy cinema culture as it existed 5 or 10 or 20 years ago. Cinema culture will still continue in some way for many decades, but it will be different than it was pre-COVID, pre-streaming. We've all seen similar transitions in other industries, and at least from my vantage point, it's a far safer bet to work with what consumers want and figure out how to make that profitable than to try to prop up the type of film culture that existed a decade or two ago. Popular music has Spotify, which pays little, but it also has concerts which remain profitable. Journalists have newspapers and magazines which are in decline, but subscription websites that are growth areas. Studios that produce film need to explore ways to support themselves, partially through theatrical releases for some projects, partially through streaming, and maybe through other avenues not yet considered to make the turn toward the mid part of the 21st century. But right now, studios, and especially theater owners, are having difficulty making that turn because their investment, and in many ways their identity, still lies in how things used to be in the recent past. Again, theaters aren't going away, but that multiplex experience will likely be a smaller part of our overall lives in the future. Producers, directors, writers, and actors will still create stunning stories for all of us to watch. But how some of those stories are delivered will likely continue to change in the years ahead. Without doubt, Genie Plus has been an interesting ride this past year. This segment I'm calling Genie Plus: The Road Ahead. My experience with Genie Plus varies widely depending on the date. On a random Monday in October, both in California and Florida, Genie Plus can be a useful add-on, particularly at the Magic Kingdom and at Disneyland, in which a guest, if they arrive early and stay late, can experience most every attraction on the Genie Plus list with little or no wait time. Genie Plus on both coasts now offers you the ability to modify your time window or even change out one experience for a different one by using the app. This alone is a significant improvement in its functionality over the original Genie Plus app that premiered about a year ago. But Genie Plus experiences over the holiday period, such as Thanksgiving and Christmas, can be frustrating, at times very frustrating. A few weeks ago, during the week of Thanksgiving, the Lightning Lane for the Haunted Mansion at the Magic Kingdom stretched nearly to the Hall of Presidents, while the Lightning Lane for Peter Pan stretched to the Carousel. The week after Christmas, the Lightning Lane for Big Thunder stretched all the way down to the raft landing for Tom Sawyer's Island, easily a 40-minute wait. During these periods, as the system is used so heavily, guests are more likely to experience only a few rides using Genie Plus. At the Magic Kingdom, I would place that number at 4 popular attractions, such as Space Mountain and Big Thunder, for the entire day, or more if you're looking at less popular rides, such as the Tomorrowland Speedway or the Journey of the Little Mermaid. At Disneyland on a very busy day, I'd place that number at 6. The Genie Plus system at Disneyland, even when the park is packed, tends to perform better due to the high number of attractions and other experiences at that park. Disneyland has far more attractions than any of the other American parks. To maximize profit and to limit demand, Genie Plus also has a surge pricing element. Genie Plus costs more when the park is crowded, and it costs less when the park is empty. During the winter holidays, the price for Genie Plus ticked up to $29 per person in Florida and $30 per person in California. What is now clear in terms of a demand model is this: surge pricing works better in Florida than it does in California. A typical trip to Disney World is far more expensive than a typical trip to Disneyland. A typical visit to Disney World involves transportation, hotels, mini meals, possibly a rental car, and park tickets. An add-on of $116 per day for Genie Plus for a family of 4 is a noticeable surcharge, particularly if you're there for a week. In California, however, it's far more common for couples to spend a day at Disneyland or even for single friends to meet up, particularly if they are Magic Key holders. These people typically drive themselves to the park, pay for a meal, maybe 2 along with parking, and if they aren't Magic Key holders, admission for a single day. For them, the add-on of $25 or $30 for an individual person or $50 or $60 for a couple is far easier to digest, as most of these visitors don't spend a night at a hotel, and if they do, it's typically only 1 night and at most 2. Families, of course, still visit Disneyland, but the ratio between family groups and friend groups is far different in California than it is in Florida. I'm sure Disney has some firm numbers on this, which would be fascinating to see, but as those numbers aren't released, I can only tell you that after going to both resorts very regularly for years, I am deeply aware that the social mix in terms of friend groups and solo visitors is far higher in California than it is in Florida. As such, surge pricing hasn't been as effective in limiting Genie Plus purchases in California. In Florida during peak days, Genie Plus costs $29, in California $30, at least as of today, January 7th. Disney World has never sold out of Genie Plus, which means that, within reason, the increased price allows supply to meet demand. In California, however, the service has now sold out on 3 days. Those days are, of course, among the busiest of the year in that week between Christmas and New Year's, specifically on December 27th, 28th, and 29th. On the app, guests entering the park later in the day on those dates simply saw the message, "Purchase of Genie Plus service is no longer offered for today." Scarcity or diminished demand here is, in ways, a good thing. A certain level of scarcity of the Genie Plus product is necessary to ensure that guests who purchase it can move through lightning lanes at a reasonable pace. In Florida during peak days, I've seen multiple lightning lanes that are longer than 30 minutes. I've not yet seen that in California, but to be fair, this is partially due to the overall attraction inventory at Disneyland, also the deep entertainment options. Along with the higher number of rides and attractions, Disneyland also typically has a parade, fireworks or castle projections, Phantasmic, and on weekends, multiple bands. From a model arranged to maximize profit, surge pricing seems to be working better in Florida on peak days, where it's $29, but less so in California. Disney needs to have a product in which few enough people purchase it so that those who spend the extra money really do find shorter lines, but it also needs to maximize profit by raising the price to the point where on busy days it nearly sells out. And if all of this were only price-based, like an introductory question in Econ 101, I'm not sure what that price would be to bring down demand to the point where it met supply, maybe $35 a day or $40. But this is not a simple Econ 101 question. 2 months ago, when Bob Chapek and his people were still running Disney, I would have been fairly confident that they would test higher pricing levels of Genie Plus in California fairly quickly, likely over spring break and Easter weekend. But there are other factors in Disney's long-term success than simple supply and demand for park add-ons. Bob Iger, the recently returned CEO, appears to be more concerned with the rehabilitation of Disney's public image, particularly for the parks. Presently, there's a narrative that Disney, for the past few years, has been more focused on money than on quality. Basically, that guests, particularly those coming home from a Florida vacation, have been saying that it was not only expensive, but less satisfying than previous Disney World trips. And at this point, there's only so much more that you can blame on the pandemic. So I'm guessing that Iger will be far more sensitive to how the brand is perceived than had been Chapek in terms of new pricing structures. That is, there might be some other pivot rather than direct price increases that is used to adjust supply and demand here, such as prioritizing Genie Plus for hotel guests on peak days rather than through a direct price increase, with the idea that sales of additional hotel rooms would be equally valuable to the company, or that it might be easier to bury an increase in Genie Plus access inside of a slightly higher room rate. Regardless, the Genie Plus product is still controversial, particularly in how money used to purchase Genie Plus was later used inside the company. In looking over the economic narrative of the past 12 months, it's clear that money received from Genie Plus at the corporate level was used to subsidize massive losses on the Disney Plus streaming service. Basically, guests to the parks paid more, though that money didn't stay with the parks to fund new attractions or higher level of services, but rather this money was used to balance the corporate books so that the Disney company overall remained profitable, even though the direct-to-consumer streaming service was losing billions of dollars in order to build market share. And this is the narrative that Iger will likely want to move against, not only to prove that the streaming service can on its own make strides towards profitability, but also so guests to the parks feel like the money they are spending there is actually paying for the services and entertainment they receive, rather than backfilling massive losses in another division of Disney. It's also clear that Genie Plus as a product is a work in progress. Genie Plus has changed quite a bit over the past year with new options and new limitations, and almost surely it will change in 2023 as well. Sometime in the next 2 or 3 weeks, I'll update our guide to Genie Plus over on Bandcamp, but I'm guessing that new advice about Genie Plus will be current for at best a few months, until it needs to be updated yet again. But if I were to give just 4 pieces of easy-to-remember advice to develop a strong Genie Plus strategy today, it would be these. Number 1, in Florida, in terms of saving time, Genie Plus is most valuable at the Magic Kingdom and then at Hollywood Studios, far less so at Animal Kingdom and Epcot. In California, it's more valuable at Disneyland and less so at DCA. Number 2. When the Disney parks are crowded, they are more expensive and they tend to be less enjoyable with long lines and crowding. Genie Plus also works best and is less expensive when the parks are less crowded. If you are planning a family vacation, try to avoid Thanksgiving and Christmas week on both coasts, as well as spring break and other major holiday weekends. Also, weekdays are better than weekends. I realize that this will be impossible for some traveling groups, but this, overall, is my number one best suggestion for planning a successful trip. If you want a summer trip, late August or even early May is far better than any week in June or July. If you want a trip around the winter holidays, the first half of December is far better than the second half, and all of those lovely seasonal decorations are up from late November through early January. If you're looking for a trip around Halloween, late September or early October is far better than the second half of October. Again, all of those decorations are up for the 2 months leading up to Halloween. The other period of low visitation is mid-January through mid-February, minus those weekends with a national holiday. And lastly, if your family is entirely beholden to school breaks to schedule your vacation, keep in mind that winter break and Thanksgiving break are the busiest times, as every school in America has the same weeks off. But spring break schedules are staggered throughout the country. They range from the beginning of March to the end of March, and some county school districts tie their spring break to Easter, which often occurs in April. Spring break is still busier than other periods of the year, but it's less busy by far than other weeks arranged for typical school breaks. Similarly, the latter part of summer break tends to be less busy than the early weeks of summer break, though this is also the hottest period of the year. Number 3, arrive early, but schedule your lightning lanes if possible later in the day. In Florida, you can make your first lightning lane selection at 7 a.m. no matter where you are. You can do that from your hotel room. In California, though, you can make your first selection the moment you walk into the park. On both coasts, the parks will be emptiest during morning hours, meaning there will be many rides with little to no wait time. In those morning hours, try to book extremely popular attractions with later entry times. In Florida, these attractions will be easy to find, such as Slinky Dog Dash, Frozen Ever After, Navi River Journey, The Jungle Cruise, and Peter Pan's Flight. Also, character meet and greets tend to fill up quickly. Book one of these, ideally with an entry time of noon or later. Then arrive at the park's opening time and use standby lines for attractions of your choosing, most of which will have a very short line. In California, you can book a second lightning lane either after you visit your first attraction or 120 minutes after making your first booking, whichever comes first. In Florida, you can book a second lightning lane after you visit your first attraction or 120 minutes after the park opens, assuming you booked your first one at 7 a.m. Again, for your second selection, I'd pick an afternoon time for a highly popular attraction so long as crowd levels remain low in your park. This strategy allows you to stack multiple lightning lanes during the afternoon when the parks are busier, while using the standby lines in the morning when the parks are relatively empty. This strategy works particularly well in California, assuming you can arrive at a park at or near its opening time, as the vast majority of Disneyland visitors drive to the park from their home, and with traffic and other issues, end up arriving later in the morning. The crowd differential in the California parks between 9 a.m. and 3 p.m. is tremendous, a little less so in Florida, where the vast majority of visitors are staying in nearby hotels and have less trouble catching a monorail, skyway, or bus and arriving at a park at or near its opening time. Still, there is a meaningful difference in attendance levels in all of the American Disney parks between 9 a.m. and 3 p.m., which affects any Genie Plus strategy. But in short, arrive at the park early, but try to book Genie Plus Lightning Lanes for later in your day. And the last suggestion on this list, number 4, ride inventory on Genie Plus is refreshed in at least 2 ways as the day progresses. First, from watching Genie Plus, it seems clear that Disney adds additional inventory at a couple of points during the day. I believe this mostly happens in the morning so that the top rides aren't entirely taken by early risers. Second, with the addition of that Modify button, more guests are exchanging previous selections for new ones, creating ongoing fluidity in the system, as those returned reservations go back into open inventory. Genie Plus, I know, already requires that guests look at their phone screens many times a day, which some people find distracts from the experience of being inside of a theme park. But if you don't mind checking and rechecking the app, you can often upgrade an existing Lightning Lane reservation. This can be particularly useful later in the day when another guest gives up a good time slot and that reservation is returned to open inventory. At 3:30 in the afternoon, for example, you might be able to swap out your 6 p.m. reservation on Space Mountain for a 4 p.m. slot on Big Thunder. If you arrived at Big Thunder at 4 p.m., this would then allow you to book another Lightning Lane experience the moment you scanned your phone at the entrance. In this way, by swapping out times, you have the potential to increase the number of Lightning Lane attractions you experience in a day. And so, without doubt, we will see a slew of new changes to Genie Plus in 2023, but these here would be the 4 suggestions that I think would improve your visit in the months ahead. 2022 was a year in which the social culture inside the American parks began to change. When Disneyland opened back in 1955, men wore suits to visit the park, women often wore dresses. But that image of the parks is largely gone. And though the current problems are caused by only a handful of guests, the popular image of the social climate inside the parks is presently at a low point. After multiple altercations in both the California and Florida parks, including a few incidents that were covered widely in newspapers and on TV and in which people were arrested, Disney now advises that guests need to be respectful of other guests while in the parks. I'm sort of at a loss as to why these incidents have increased in the past year or two, but there are 2 explanations that each, I suspect, holds some element of truth. The first has to do with a change of public attitudes after the pandemic. The pandemic encouraged, or perhaps forced, individuals to more deeply identify as members of a family, and perhaps as an extension, to be more sensitive to slights and other intrusions on family space and perceived family rights. This may have led to 1 or 2 of the larger fights inside of the Magic Kingdom. The other explanation concerns cost. As the price increases for a Disney vacation, guests have higher expectations for their experience inside the parks and may feel a deeper sense of loss or irritation if another person or group interferes with that experience. Basically, when tickets cost $100 per day, a person might have 1 set of expectations. But when tickets cost twice that, they might have a proportionally higher set of expectations, which presently, with long lines for rides, shortages of dining reservations, occasionally a shortage of park reservations, and a reduced level of in-park entertainment, may simply not be met, bringing a person closer to the point where they respond with anger when those troubles are compounded by guests whose behavior is less than courteous. But as of the start of 2023, there is now an official Disney Code of Conduct for its parks on both coasts. Disneyland, which has had fewer such incidents, has a low-stakes policy which simply asks guests to be courteous of others. Specifically, it says, "Please show common courtesy to fellow guests and our cast members by not using profanity or engaging in unsafe, illegal, disruptive, or offensive behavior, jumping lines, or saving places in lines for others." But Disney World, which has had more high-profile physical altercations, perhaps related to the higher cost of a Disney World vacation, has a more strict policy that can result with expulsion from the entire resort. Specifically, it says, "Be the magic you want to see in the world. You must always remember to treat others with respect, kindness, and compassion. Those who can't live up to this simple wish may be asked to leave the Disney World Resort." In practice, this is what Disney World has done in recent months. It has trespassed guests from the resort, essentially banning them, though at least one incident, in which two families brawled in Fantasyland because one family believed the other cut in line, ended in multiple arrests. These policies are an attempt to create a more harmonious atmosphere inside the parks, essentially to return them to a pre-pandemic state, even though problems stemming from the pandemic, including labor and supply shortages, continue to plague the resorts. Officially, about 90% of pre-pandemic elements have been re-engaged in the parks, minus some restaurant experiences, some tours, some live entertainment, and a few other add-ons. But the feel of the parks for many has not yet fully returned, a good chunk of which is due to labor shortages, and this too may be fueling the need, for the first time, for Disney to codify behavior for those who want to experience the parks. Lastly, we have an update on a story that we've been following now for nearly a year. The story about the dissolution of the Reedy Creek Improvement District, which covers the land where Disney World exists. Regular listeners already know that Reedy Creek is a special tax district created in 1967 that allows Reedy Creek to tax Disney at a higher rate than that for most of Florida to maintain roads and develop public services that benefit the theme parks. The act that created the special district also allowed Reedy Creek to sell bonds and take on debt to create public works, which are mostly roads, around the Disney resort. In general, Disney pays higher taxes to this special district to ensure that it has impeccable roads and public services at a very high standard, and also so it has direct access to governing bodies that approve various permits. All permits are still vetted just as they are in other areas of Florida, only there is little wait time for the Disney projects to be reviewed, as Reedy Creek is almost entirely made up of the Disney development. In creating those public works areas in the district, Reedy Creek has taken on at least $1 billion in debt, and that is probably closer to $2 billion, which will be paid back slowly over years as Reedy Creek collects taxes from Disney. In general, this is financially beneficial to those who live in nearby counties, as without this special district, the counties nearby would need to pay for things like roads and the fire department around the Disney resort. Early last year, after Disney publicly objected to what is commonly called the Don't Say Gay bill, Governor DeSantis and the Florida legislature passed a bill intending to dissolve Reedy Creek by this June. In the days after that bill passed, it became clear that many lawmakers outside of those attached to Central Florida wrongly believed that this special district lowered Disney's taxes when in fact it raised them, and that dissolving this special district would either put local counties or the state itself on the hook for hundreds of millions of dollars in bond debt that the district had accumulated. This past fall, reports bubbled up that behind-the-door talks were ongoing between the state of Florida and Disney to solve the problem, At best, the current bill serves no one's needs, and at worst, the bill could be deemed an unconstitutional overreach of state powers. A change like this in the financial structure of the district also opens up the state to potential lawsuits from Disney, from residents of Orange and Osceola counties who might have to make up the cost of the districts, and from actual bondholders, as a change in the district ownership might devalue bond securities they purchased from Reedy Creek. There's already one lawsuit that appears to be moving forward from local residents, as they believe the dissolution of the district may lead to future financial harm for residents. The latest proposal put forward by the Florida legislature would transfer power from the current board, which are elected by landowners inside the district, to a state-controlled board, which would then create a situation in which Disney repaid Reedy Creek debts, but also a situation in which landowners inside the district were deprived of their voting rights, essentially disenfranchising those that the district was designed to serve. And this is the fundamental problem for this new proposal. On the business and tax site Bloomberg, Jacob Schumer, a Florida attorney, explained the difficulties to enact a state-controlled board inside of Reedy Creek. And the following is a quote from his article. The legal problem for Florida is that to take away Disney's control of Reedy Creek is to take away voting power of the landowners within a district, Schumer said. Reedy Creek's Enabling Act places it under the direct control of a board of supervisors, which are elected by owners of the property within the district on a 1-acre, 1-vote method of election, a standard method of electing a special district's governing body. The reason Disney controls Reedy Creek is because the district was drawn to contour the land owned or controlled by Disney. If Florida attempts to place Reedy Creek under state control, Disney will have a much stronger court case than if the state simply dissolved the district. Depending on who you ask, Disney already had a claim that dissolving the district was unconstitutional retaliation for protected speech in violation of the First Amendment. However, that claim was not entirely clear, as it would be unusual for a court to step in to say a state cannot dissolve one of its own subdivisions based on an alleged improper motive. Disney's right to elect its representatives is much stronger than its right to have Reedy Creek exist at all. Disney, as a property owner, was granted the statutory right to elect the district's board of supervisors. If Florida tried to replace it with state political appointees, the situation would go from the state managing its own subdivisions to the state taking away a landowner's right to vote for its local representatives. And action courts are much more accustomed to stepping in to prevent. And this, generally, is where things are right now with this issue, as the clock slowly ticks toward the current deadline of June to dissolve the district, something that no one now, including the state government, wants. And so, as we begin 2023, we are still moving through some of the problems from 2022 with Genie Plus, the diminished power of the multiplex, and here with Reedy Creek. And I'm guessing that many of these issues will continue to play out with new developments in those months ahead. I'll be back next week with a new episode. At least right now, the plan is to continue our story of Disney artist Herb Ryman. As you know, this podcast is funded entirely by listener contributions. You can support our efforts by becoming a monthly Bandcamp subscriber, which also gives you access to dozens of episodes not available anywhere else. You can become a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in the show notes. I hope the coming week is good to all of you. Until then, this is Todd James Pierce.